There's fossil evidence of a shark with a circular saw for teeth, a herbivore with Freddy Krueger claws, and something with 5 eyes that used a vacuum cleaner for a mouth. And somehow, those aren't even the 3 weirdest creatures that have once lived on our planet. So, back in 1972, this scientist named Harry Whittington walks into a room full of other scientists. He's got this fossil reconstruction he's been working on, and when he shows it to them, they start laughing. Not like polite chuckling, they full on laugh at him, because what he had shown them looked like someone had drawn an alien creature while having a fever dream. This thing was called OPABINIA, and it lived 505 million years ago in what's now Canada, the Burgess Shale, which is basically where all of the weird Cambrian creatures got buried and turned into fossils. I actually used to live in the area where you could find fossils. I grew up on a farm, and we would find actual fossilized shells in the ground. It was pretty cool. But now here's what made scientists laugh so hard at him. This thing had 5 eyes. 5 on little stalks sticking out of its head. Most animals have 2 eyes, right? Some have more, but 5? And they were all pointing in different directions, like it was trying to watch 5 different TV channels at once. But wait, it gets worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. It had this long, flexible nose thing that was about 4 times longer than its head. Imagine if your nose was longer than your entire body. But this nose had a claw at the end of it. Yes, a claw on its nose. And here's the real kicker. Its mouth was on the bottom of its body, facing backwards. So this thing was swimming around with its mouth pointing the wrong way, using its nose claw to grab food and somehow getting it to its backwards mouth. The whole thing was only about 2 to 3 inches long too. So picture this tiny underwater creature with 5 eyes on stalks, a super long nose with a claw, and a backwards mouth, just swimming around minding its own business 505 million years ago. When scientists first found this thing, they had no idea what to do with it. They couldn't figure out if it was related to anything else that had ever lived. It was just too weird. It used its nose claw to grab soft prey from the ocean floor. Little worms, maybe some other small creatures. Then it had to somehow get that food back to its backwards mouth. The whole setup seems like it was designed by someone who had never seen an animal before. But scientists stopped laughing pretty quickly when they realized that this creature actually works. But if a backwards mouth is confusing, wait until you meet the creature scientists built completely upside down. Meet HALLUCIGENIA, the creature that made paleontologists question their life choices for half a century. So this thing was first found in 1911, but it wasn't until 1977 that a scientist named Simon Conway Morris really tried to figure out what it was. And he got it so wrong that it's honestly impressive. Picture this, you've got this small worm-like creature, maybe around 2 inches long. It's got these sharp spines sticking out on one side and these soft tentacle things on the other side. Morris looks at this and thinks, obviously it walks on the spines and feeds the tentacles. So for 50 years, every museum, every textbook, every reconstruction showed HALLUCIGENIA walking around on these sharp spines like some kind of medieval torture device with legs. The spines were like 3 inches long on a 2-inch animal. But wait, there's more. Morris also couldn't figure out which end was the head and which was the tail. So he just picked one and went with it, and he was wrong again. This lasted until 1991. And that's when 2 scientists found better fossils in China and realized something pretty important. Those feeding tentacles had tiny claws on the end. You know what has claws? Legs. You know what doesn't have claws? Feeding tentacles. So they flipped the whole thing over. The spines weren't legs, they were armor on its back. The tentacles were actually its walking legs. HALLUCIGENIA had been doing a headstand in museums for basically 50 years. But scientists still couldn't find the head. There was just this dark blob on one end that everyone thought was just a poorly preserved head. Turns out it wasn't a head at all. It was basically ancient poop. The real head wasn't found until 2014. Some scientists used super powerful microscopes and finally spotted 2 tiny eyes and a mouth full of needle-like teeth on the opposite end from where everyone thought it was. So just to recap, for over a century, scientists had this thing upside down, backwards, and headless. Yeah, the crazy part, HALLUCIGENIA is related to modern velvet worms. So this nightmare creature actually has living relatives walking around today with us. And speaking of creatures that stumped scientists, this next one was literally just teeth for over 100 years. Because scientists had found a spiral of teeth and had absolutely no idea what animal they came from. So picture this, you find a circular saw made of teeth. Just teeth, no skull, no bones, no body parts, nothing else. And you have to figure out what kind of animal this belonged to and where on that animal these teeth went. This was HELICOPRION, the buzzsaw shark that wasn't actually a shark. The teeth were huge. Some of them were over 4 inches long, and they were arranged in this perfect spiral with about 180 teeth total. As new teeth grew, the old ones got pushed towards the center of the spiral. So this thing never lost its teeth, it just kept adding more. But here's where it gets fun. Scientists had no clue where to put this thing. Some thought the spiral went on the back like a fin, for defense or maybe showing off to other helicoprions. Others thought it went on the tail, because why not have a tail made of teeth? The most popular idea was that it went in the upper jaw, which would have been terrifying, but also it would have been completely wrong. This guessing game lasted from the 1800s up until 2013. That's when scientists finally found some jaw bones in Idaho and used CT scans to figure out where everything went. Turns out the tooth spiral filled up the entire lower jaw, the whole thing. And here's the really weird part. There were no upper teeth at all, none. So this thing could literally gum you and saw you at the same time. The upper jaw was just soft tissue that would clamp down while the lower spiral of death teeth rotated backwards through whatever it was eating. Although it probably ate soft stuff like squid and small fish. The teeth weren't really built for cutting through bone or shells, more like a meat grinder for squishy things. The whole animal is probably about 25 to 30 feet long though, so imagine a school bus sized creature swimming around with a lower jaw full of circular saw teeth and no upper teeth to match. Scientists actually now think it was more related to modern ratfish than actual sharks, which makes sense because actual sharks don't need engineering degrees to figure out how their mouths work, but at least that creature stayed underwater where it belonged, because this is TANYSTROPHEUS, a reptile that was basically just a neck with a small body attached as an afterthought. When scientists first found fossils of this thing back in the 1800s, they thought they discovered pterosaur wing bones. The finger bones that supported the wing membrane. They were so long and hollow that it just seemed obvious. Except they weren't wing bones at all. They were neck bones from a reptile whose neck was 10 feet long. The whole animal was about 20 feet long, which means more than half of it was just neck. And this wasn't some flexible snake neck either. It was stiff as a board because of all these overlapping ribs that ran along the vertebrae. So picture this thing swimming around 242 million years ago. It's got this tiny little head on the end of a 10-foot pole, attached to a small body with stubby legs. It looks like someone stuck a lizard head on a pool cleaning tool. But here's the thing, this reptile actually worked. Scientists figured out there were actually 2 different species. The big one had long fangs for catching fish and squid. The smaller one had these weird 3-pointed teeth for eating shrimp and other small stuff. They both lived in the same waters but ate completely different things, which is smart because if you're gonna look that ridiculous, you might as well avoid competing with your relatives for food. The neck was too stiff for fast swimming, so these things were likely ambush predators. They'd hide in murky water or behind rocks, then shoot that 10-foot neck out to grab something. The nostrils were on top of their heads as well, so they could breathe while staying mostly underwater. It's like evolution decided to see how impractical it could make a predator and still have it survive, and somehow it worked for millions of years. The fossils are found in what used to be shallow seas around Switzerland and Italy, so while everyone else was evolving normal proportions, TANYSTROPHEUS was just out there being a living fishing rod and apparently doing just fine. But that's nothing compared to the reptile that tried to fly with its legs. Meet SHAROVIPTERYX, the only animal in Earth's history that decided wings should go on the back legs. This thing lived 225 billion years ago in what's now Kyrgyzstan, and evolution looked at this design, tried it once, and then never ever did it again. Think about that for a second. In over 200 million years since then, nothing has evolved leg wings. Not birds, not bats, not flying squirrels. Nothing. That should tell you something. SHAROVIPTERYX was about 10 inches long. It had these massive elongated hind legs with skin stretched between them and its tail. That was its main wing surface. But its front legs? They were tiny little stubs. Basically, they were useless for flying. This thing was basically trying to fly with its pants while its arms were too small to help. The crazy part is that it actually worked. Scientists have tested the design and found out it could glide pretty well. The tiny front arms had small wing membranes that worked like front fins on a plane, helping it steer and stay stable. It could control its gliding by bending its knees and moving its feet around, which means it was doing aerial maneuvers with its ankles. We only know about this thing because of one fossil. One, that's it. Someone found this single skeleton in 1965, and that's literally all the evidence we have that leg wings were ever a thing. It lived in forests and probably spent its time jumping from tree to tree, gliding on its ridiculous leg wings and eating insects. The area where it lived was warm and humid with tons of bugs, so there was probably plenty to eat. But here's what gets me. This design actually worked well enough that SHAROVIPTERYX survived and reproduced. It wasn't just some weird mutant that died immediately. This was a successful animal that lived its whole life flying around on its legs. And yet evolution just dropped the whole idea. Every other flying animal that came after went with arm wings or rip wings or modified feathers. Nobody ever tried the leg wing thing again. I know they can't really choose, but it never happened again. Maybe it worked, but not well enough. Maybe it was too weird even for evolution. Or maybe this species died out because of the leg wings. We'll never know. And speaking of evolution's questionable design choices, the next creature had weapons too delicate for fighting. What do I mean? Well, this is THERIZINOSAURUS, and it had claws longer than baseball bats and used them to make salad. I'm not kidding, this thing was a plant eater, a vegetarian, with 3-foot-long claws on each hand. When scientists first found these claws in Mongolia back in the 1940s, they thought they discovered some kind of giant prehistoric turtle, because nothing else made sense. The claws were flat and huge, and they had no idea what kind of animal could have them. Turns out, it was a theropod dinosaur. You know, if you recognize that word, you will probably realize that that's the same group that includes the T-Rex and the Velociraptor, which are all scary meat eaters. Except this one decided that meat was overrated. THERIZINOSAURUS was about 33 feet long and weighed as much as an elephant. It had a long neck, a small head, and a big pot belly for digesting all of those yummy plants. And those famous claws that everyone freaks out about. But here's the thing that's gonna blow your mind. Despite Jurassic World Dominion and every other media this creature has been featured in, those claws were basically useless for fighting. Scientists tested them and found out they were too thin and weak to be weapons. If THERIZINOSAURUS tried to fight a T-Rex with those claws, they'd probably just break straight off. So what were they for? Well, pulling down tree branches. That's it. This thing was basically a giant sloth with anger issues. It would grab a branch with its claws, pull it down to its mouth, and strip off all the leaves. The claws were perfect for hooking onto branches, but terrible for everything else. Think about that. Evolution spent millions of years giving this animal the most terrifying looking weapons in the dinosaur world, and it used them to reach the high shelf at the salad bar. The small head and leaf-shaped teeth were dead giveaways that this thing wasn't hunting anything bigger than a fern, but it took scientists decades to figure that out because those claws were just so damn intimidating. And the best part, this thing probably had feathers. Some of its relatives that we're going to talk about soon definitely did. So picture a giant, fluffy, pot-bellied dinosaur with 3-foot-long claws, waddling around the forest and eating leaves. Scientists call it the Freddy Krueger of the late Cretaceous, which is pretty unfair to Freddy Krueger. At least his claws could actually hurt someone. But if you think that dinosaur is confusing, wait until you meet the 50-year mystery arms. Because in 1965, scientists in Mongolia found a pair of arms, just arms, 8-foot-long arms with massive claws attached to some shoulder bones. And that was it. No skull, no body, no legs, nothing else, just these huge, terrible hands sitting in the desert. For almost 50 years, paleontologists had no idea what these arms belonged to. They named it DEINOCHEIRUS, which means terrible hand, and then spent decades trying to figure out what kind of monster could have arms that big. The arms were built like a heavyweight boxer's. Everything about them screamed dangerous predator. So scientists figured out this thing was probably some kind of giant killer dinosaur that could tear apart pretty much anything. But again, they were so wrong, it's almost funny. In 2014, scientists finally found more complete skeletons. When they put the pieces together, they realized DEINOCHEIRUS was basically a giant duck. Well, not exactly a duck, but it was an ornithomimosaur, which is the group that includes all the ostrich-like dinosaurs, except this one was the size of a school bus and had a hump on its back. The skull was over 3 feet long with a flat spoon-shaped beak. No teeth, just a big scooping mouth for grabbing stuff out of swamps and rivers. Scientists found fish bones and over 1,400 stomach stones inside one skeleton. Stomach stones. This thing was eating fish and using rocks to grind up its food because it didn't have teeth. So those terrible hands that everyone thought belonged to an apex predator, again, they were actually just really good scoops for catching fish and pulling down plants. But here's where it gets interesting. One of the key specimens that solved this mystery had been stolen by fossil poachers and sold to private collectors. Scientists had to track it down and get it back before they could actually figure out what DEINOCHEIRUS actually was. The whole thing lived in swampy areas in what's now Mongolia about 70 million years ago. It's probably spent its days waiting around, scooping up fish and plants with those massive arms, looking like the world's most overdeveloped fishing guide. 50 years of thinking you found a monster, only to discover it's a giant humpback humpbacked waterfowl with anger management issues. But that's nothing compared to the shark that grew furniture on its back. Yes, you heard me right, furniture. STETHACANTHUS was a shark that decided the best way to attract females was to grow an anvil on its back. I should try that next time when I'm trying to get a date. Let's see if it works. This thing lived about 300 billion years ago, and only the males had this weird structure. Picture a normal shark, but with this flat, table-shaped fin sticking up from its back, covered in little spikes. Scientists have called it an ironing board, an anvil, and even a toothbrush, because that's what it looked like. A piece of furniture glued to a shark's back. And here's the craziest part, this thing actually worked for them. We know this because STETHACANTHUS survived for millions of years, which means the females were apparently into the whole furniture look. I don't get it. The leading theory is that males use these structures for mating displays. Maybe they'd swim up to females to just show off their back anvils, or they'd use them to wrestle with other males. The top of the structure and a patch on the shark's head were covered with enlarged spikes. So not only did this thing have furniture on its back, but the furniture had spikes on it. This would have made swimming really difficult. The whole structure created drag in the water, so these sharks were probably pretty slow, which means they traded speed for whatever this bizarre display was supposed to accomplish. Their teeth were also relatively small, so they weren't going after big prey anyways. They probably just ate small fish and whatever else they could catch while dragging their back furniture through the water. When scientists first found fossils of these things in the late 1800s, they had no idea what they were looking at. The spines were found separately from the body, and they thought they were part of the shark's side fins. So it took almost a century to figure out that no, these things were actually growing anvils on their backs. Other related sharks had their own weird structures. One called Falcatus had males with long sword-like spines sticking forwards over their heads. So apparently the whole early shark family was just trying out different ridiculous accessories. The fact that these designs lasted for millions of years means that they must have worked, but it's hard to imagine being a female shark and thinking, you know what's attractive? A guy with an ironing board growing out of his spine. But that's still not as weird as the millipede that was bigger than your car. That was the Arthropleura, and yes, it was basically just a giant version of the little bugs you find under the rocks, except this one was 9 feet long and weighed over 110 pounds. This thing had around 44 pairs of legs, 88 legs in total, all moving in these rippling ways as it crawled through the coal swamps of the Carboniferous forest. And here's the craziest part, it was completely harmless. Arthropleura was a vegetarian. Scientists found fossil trackways that show this thing could actually move pretty fast when it wanted to. Picture 88 legs all working together to power this giant millipede through the forest. The tracks are sometimes 2 feet wide even. So why was this and everything so huge back then? Well, the air had way more oxygen, like 35% oxygen compared to today's 21%. That extra oxygen meant bugs could grow to ridiculous sizes without suffocating. We actually don't know what Arthropleura's head looked like until very recently. Most fossils were just molted shells the animals left behind as they grew, but scientists finally found some small specimens with heads intact. Turns out it had 2 antennae, little eye stalks sticking out of the sides, and tiny jaws hidden underneath. So basically, a giant friendly face on a car-sized bug body. The weirdest thing is that Arthropleura probably never had any real predators, because what's gonna mess the 9-foot millipede? Early reptiles were still pretty small back then. This thing could have accidentally stepped on a proto-dinosaur and not even noticed. It also lived in those warm, swampy forests that would eventually become coal. Tons of dead plant matter everywhere, which was perfect for a giant leaf muncher. But when the climate changed and those swampy forests dried up, Arthropleura went extinct. Turns out being the size of a car only works if you've got enough food to fuel all 88 legs. The whole species group lasted around 56 billion years though, which is pretty impressive for something that looked like it escaped from a nightmare about gardening. This next creature confused scientists for over a century. This is Macrauchenia, and Charles Darwin himself found the first fossils of this thing in 1834. Darwin was just walking around Patagonia collecting random bones for science when he came across this bizarre skeleton. He had absolutely no idea what he had found, and honestly, that makes sense, because Macrauchenia looked like someone had taken parts of 3 different animals and glued them together wrong. It had the body of a camel, 3-toed feet, and nostrils that were located between its eyes. Not on the end of its snout where nostrils belong, but between its eyes. Oh, this thing's an ice age. This thing lived until about 12,000 years ago, which means early humans probably saw these walking around. Imagine being a caveman and running into a camel with its nose in the wrong place. Although if you were a caveman back then, this probably would have been common. Scientists have been arguing about that nose placement for over 150 years. Some think it had a trunk, others think it had a big inflatable nose. Some think it had a moose-like lip. Nobody really knows. What we do know is that this thing was successful. It lived all over South America for millions of years, eating both grass and leaves. But the nose thing really bothered scientists. Why would evolution put nostrils there? It doesn't make sense for any normal mammal. Recently, scientists used DNA analysis to figure out what Macraochenia was related to. Turns out its closest living relatives are horses and rhinos, which makes the whole thing even weirder. Horses have normal noses. Rhinos have normal noses. Somehow, their ancient South American cousin evolved eyeball nostrils and three-toed feet. The whole group it belonged to, called the Lepidopterans, was one of those weird South American experiments that evolution tried during the continent's isolation, and Macraochenia was one of the last survivors before they all went extinct. Darwin collected these bones thinking he'd found some kind of weird llama. The scientist who studied them, Richard Owen, was also completely confused. They named it long neck because that was the only part that made sense. It took molecular biology in the 21st century to finally figure out where this thing fit in the mammal family tree. It was over 180 years of scientists looking at this thing and basically shrugging. There you have it. Which of these creatures did you think was the weirdest? There's tons more out there and probably tons more we haven't even studied or discovered yet. I'd love to hear different creatures you want me to cover down in the comments below. And if you like this video, you should like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff about dinosaurs and prehistory. And if you want to watch a video that's even better than this one, then click the video on screen now.